When a wealthy woman hires a nanny, she assumes their roles are as simple as employer and employee. But as tensions rise and secrets begin to unravel, the truth about who her nanny really is shocks her to the core. How will this discovery change their lives forever? Subscribe to the channel and follow to see how this story unfolds. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Rachel Carter stood in her pristine kitchen, eyeing the rows of freshly polished countertops as if a single smudge might shatter her world. Everything in the Carter household was curated to perfection: the marble floors, imported from Italy, the stainless steel appliances that gleamed under the soft, custom lighting, even the fruit in the centerpiece bowl seemed suspiciously symmetrical. It was, by all accounts, a life of luxury. But Rachel, dressed in her tailored white blouse and pearls, wore the expression of someone deeply dissatisfied. "Mommy, where's my backpack?" her 8-year-old son, Oliver, shouted from the top of the staircase. Rachel took a sip from her green juice, composed herself, and called back. "Ask Evelyn. She should know." Evelyn Lewis, the new nanny, emerged quietly from the laundry room with Oliver's backpack in hand. She walked with a kind of composed grace that Rachel couldn't decide if she found admirable or unnerving. Evelyn was always deliberate, always prepared. She didn't rush or fluster even under pressure. Rachel had once joked to a friend that the woman could probably organize a toddler's tea party and an emergency evacuation with the same measured efficiency. Rachel gave Evelyn a curt nod as she handed Oliver his backpack. "You really should teach him to organize his things better. It's not healthy for a child his age to rely on you for everything." "Yes, Ma," Evelyn said simply. There was no malice in her tone, only the polite acknowledgement that Rachel's remarks rarely required an actual response. Oliver bounded down the stairs, grabbing the bag with a quick thanks, Evelyn, before heading out the door. Evelyn's gaze lingered on the boy with a faint smile, but Rachel's sharp tone pulled her attention back. "Evelyn," Rachel began, setting her glass down with a deliberate clink. "I'll need you to stay a little later tonight. I have a dinner meeting, and Charles is flying back late from Denver." "Of course," Evelyn replied, her voice steady as always. She wasn't one to ask questions or push back, something Rachel had appreciated when hiring her. But sometimes Rachel wished Evelyn would display even a flicker of human annoyance. It would make her feel less like she was speaking to a robot. Rachel wasn't the type to dwell on her privilege, but she knew it existed. Her days were a carousel of yoga classes, charity galas, and managing Oliver's school activities. She hired people like Evelyn to take care of the messier parts of life. Yet there was something about Evelyn that Rachel couldn't quite place. Her qualifications had been impeccable degrees from prestigious schools, glowing references, but her demeanor suggested a woman accustomed to much more than folding laundry and preparing after-school snacks. Rachel's friends often commented on her household staff. "You know, her best friend, Stephanie, had whispered conspiratorially over lunch one afternoon, 'Some of these nannies have ulterior motives. You'd better make sure she's not trying to steal your life.'" Rachel had laughed it off at the time, but she couldn't completely shake the paranoia. Evelyn was far too composed, far too polished for someone in her position. Later that evening, Rachel sat in her sunroom scrolling through her phone, half listening as Evelyn read to Oliver in the living room. The rhythmic cadence of her voice carried into the adjoining space, lulling Oliver into a calm Rachel rarely managed to achieve with him herself. It annoyed her. "She's just a nanny," Rachel muttered under her breath, scrolling more aggressively. Why did Evelyn always seem to overshadow her in these small, irritating ways? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Stephanie, uninvited but not unexpected. Stephanie rarely gave warning before dropping by, considering herself more of a sister than a friend. "So this is the famous Evelyn," Stephanie said, dropping her handbag on the couch and casting a curious glance toward the living room. Evelyn glanced up from the book she was holding and offered a polite smile. "Good evening." "She's very composed," Stephanie whispered to Rachel as they walked into the kitchen. "Yes, she's fine," Rachel replied dismissively, pouring 2 glasses of white wine. She didn't want to admit that Evelyn's unshakable poise occasionally unnerved her. Stephanie leaned in. "Fine. You pay her to be practically family, and that's all you have to say." Rachel stiffened. "I don't pay her to be family. I pay her to do her job." Still, Stephanie mused, swirling her wine. "I'd keep an eye on her. She's too polished for my liking. After Stephanie left, Rachel wandered into the living room. Evelyn was tidying up, stacking books neatly on the coffee table and folding a throw blanket. "Evelyn," Rachel said abruptly, "do you mind if I ask you something personal?" Evelyn paused, hands resting lightly on the edge of the coffee table. "Of course, Ma, I am." "What made you want to be a nanny? With your background, I mean." Evelyn met her gaze evenly. "I enjoy working with children. It's meaningful work." Rachel frowned. It wasn't the kind of answer she expected. Something felt missing, like Evelyn was carefully avoiding the full truth. But before she could press further, her phone buzzed with a notification. Dinner meeting. She waved Evelyn off, saying, "Just make sure Oliver's in bed by 8. "Yes, ma'am." Rachel grabbed her coat and left, but the question lingered in her mind long after she drove away. When she returned that night, the house was dark and silent. Rachel tiptoed into Oliver's room to find him fast asleep, his favorite stuffed animal tucked under his arm. Evelyn must have left already, as she often did, quietly and without fuss. On the kitchen counter, Rachel found a note in Evelyn's neat handwriting. "Oliver had a wonderful day. All homework completed. Dinner leftovers in the fridge." For reasons she couldn't articulate, Rachel felt a pang of guilt. She dismissed it as fatigue and climbed the stairs to her bedroom. But even as she drifted to sleep, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to Evelyn than she was letting on. Would Evelyn's layers begin to unravel? Would Rachel's carefully curated world withstand the ripples caused by the seemingly impenetrable grace of her nanny? Rachel had no answers yet, but something told her she was about to find out. The morning started with a cacophony of chaos that could only be found in the Carter household. Rachel stormed into the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Her hands were full, coffee mug in one, phone in the other, as she juggled a rushed conversation with a friend while barking orders to Oliver. "Oliver, I told you to pack your lunch last night," Rachel snapped, her voice rising above the buzz of her Bluetooth headset. "And no, Stephanie, I don't care what the florist said, hydrangeas are absolutely necessary for the centerpiece. I'll deal with it." Evelyn, as usual, moved silently through the commotion. She placed Oliver's packed lunch on the counter without comment and began wiping the already immaculate countertop. She knew better than to interrupt Rachel's frenetic energy, but Oliver's face lit up when he spotted his lunch bag. "Thanks, Evelyn," Oliver beamed, grabbing it. Rachel's gaze flicked to the bag, her expression tightening. "Oliver, what did I just say? You need to pack your lunch, not rely on Evelyn to do it for you." But she... "No excuses," Rachel cut him off, turning her attention to Evelyn. "This is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. You're supposed to be helping him become more independent, not coddling him." Evelyn paused, meeting Rachel's eyes with her usual calm composure. "I apologize if I overstepped, Ma, I am. It won't happen again." Her tone was neutral, devoid of defensiveness, which only seemed to frustrate Rachel further. "Good," Rachel said curtly, turning back to her phone conversation. "Stephanie, I swear it's like I'm running this house single-handedly." Oliver shot Evelyn an apologetic look as he slung his backpack over his shoulder. "Sorry," he whispered. Evelyn gave him a small, reassuring smile. "Have a good day at school, Oliver." As Oliver headed out the door, Rachel glanced at her watch and muttered something under her breath. "Evelyn, I need you to take the car and run a few errands today. Pick up the dry cleaning, stop by the store for dinner ingredients, and drop off my donation for the PTA fundraiser." Evelyn nodded, scribbling the tasks into her small notebook. "Of course, Ma, I am. Is there anything specific you'd like for dinner?" Rachel waved a hand dismissively. "Something light but elegant. Charles doesn't like anything too heavy after a business trip. Use your judgment." The day unfolded predictably until Evelyn returned from the errands. She placed the grocery bags on the counter and began unpacking when Rachel swept into the room, looking frazzled. "Did you get the wine I asked for?" Rachel asked sharply, rifling through the bags. "Yes, ma'am. It's in the second bag," Evelyn replied. Rachel pulled out the bottle, her expression softening only slightly. "And the dry cleaning? Was everything ready?" "Yes, ma'am," Evelyn said again, keeping her tone polite and professional. "Good," Rachel replied. "Then, As if something suddenly struck her, she added, "I noticed you didn't take a lunch break today. That's not necessary. You're allowed to stop and eat, you know." Evelyn glanced up, momentarily caught off guard by the comment. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll keep that in mind." Rachel nodded, seemingly satisfied, but as she left the kitchen, Evelyn caught a glimpse of the expression on her face, an odd mixture of guilt and annoyance, as if Rachel couldn't decide whether to feel generous or irritated. Later that evening, the simmering tension between the two finally boiled over. Rachel had just finished a call with a difficult client and was in no mood for interruptions. But when she walked into the living room and found Evelyn helping Oliver with his math homework, something in her snapped. "Evelyn," Rachel said sharply, causing both Oliver and Evelyn to look up. "I specifically told you not to baby him. He needs to learn to figure these things out on his own." Evelyn, ever composed, closed the workbook and stood. "I understand your concerns, ma'am. Oliver asked for help, and I thought it was better to guide him than let him struggle unnecessarily." Better for who? Rachel shot back. "For you to play hero? He's never going to grow up if you keep swooping in every time something gets hard." Oliver squirmed in his chair, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Mom," she was just. "Go to your room, Oliver," Rachel interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. As Oliver slunk out of the room, Evelyn stood her ground, her expression calm but firm. "I apologize if my actions upset you, ma'am, but my goal is always to support Oliver in the way that's best for him." Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "Support? You've been here all of 5 minutes and think you know what's best for my son? Let me remind you, you work for me. I'm his mother. I decide what's best." Evelyn's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something disappointment, perhaps, in her eyes. "Of course, ma'am. I'll make sure to follow your instructions more closely in the future." With that, Evelyn excused herself, leaving Rachel alone in the living room. For a moment, Rachel felt a surge of triumph, but it was quickly followed by a pang of something else. Doubt? Shame? She couldn't quite place it. Rachel poured herself a glass of wine and sank into the couch. She stared at the math workbook on the coffee table, Evelyn's precise handwriting filling the margins with neat, step-by-step explanations. Despite her frustration, Rachel couldn't shake the thought that Evelyn's way, calm, steady, thoughtful, might not have been entirely wrong. The day of the Carter family's long-anticipated garden party had arrived, and Rachel was in her element. Clad in a flowing designer dress, she moved around her sprawling backyard like a conductor orchestrating a symphony. The caterers buzzed about, setting up tables laden with gourmet finger foods and champagne flutes, while waitstaff in crisp uniforms adjusted floral arrangements in meticulously aligned place settings. Rachel's closest friends, members of the same exclusive social circle, were already trickling in. Each guest was an image of affluence, from their couture dresses to the diamonds glinting on their fingers. Conversation flowed effortlessly, a mix of idle gossip and subtle competition disguised as compliments. Evelyn, as always, worked in the background. Her role for the evening extended far beyond childcare. Rachel had asked her to supervise the staff and ensure everything ran smoothly. Evelyn didn't complain, even as the demands piled up. She moved with her characteristic grace, quietly stepping in to adjust a crooked napkin here, smooth a frazzled waiter's nerves there. Rachel, meanwhile, barely acknowledged her. Evelyn was part of the background, blending seamlessly into the machinery of the event, or so Rachel thought. As the sun dipped low, bathing the garden in a golden glow, the air buzzed with the mingling voices of guests. Rachel stood near the patio, laughing a little too loudly at one of Stephanie's jokes, when her husband Charles finally arrived. He stepped through the French doors, his presence immediately commanding attention with his tall frame and tailored suit. "Charles, darling," Rachel cooed, rushing over to greet him. "You're just in time." Charles gave her a distracted kiss on the cheek before scanning the crowd. "Impressive turnout," he said with a hint of pride. "You've outdone yourself." "Of course I have," Rachel replied, preening. "Everything's perfect." But it wasn't. Not entirely. The first crack in Rachel's carefully curated evening came when a high-profile guest, Senator Grace Aldridge, arrived unexpectedly. Grace was a commanding woman in her late 50s, known for her sharp wit and formidable presence in Washington. Rachel had invited her weeks ago, but the senator had declined due to prior commitments. Her arrival now was both a surprise and a golden opportunity for Rachel to cement her standing among the elite. Senator Aldridge. Rachel greeted her with a dazzling smile. What a delightful surprise. Grace returned the smile, though hers carried the weight of a seasoned politician, polite, measured, and unyielding. I found myself free this evening and couldn't resist the chance to see the famous Carter estate. Rachel laughed, guiding Grace toward the patio where a fresh glass of champagne awaited her. The senator seemed content to mingle, and Rachel breathed a sigh of relief. But her calm was short-lived. As the evening wore on, Rachel noticed something strange. Grace, normally the center of attention, was no longer engaging with the other guests. Instead, she stood near the kitchen doorway, speaking in hushed tones with Evelyn. Rachel's stomach tightened. Evelyn's role was to blend in, not to converse with high-profile guests. What could she possibly have to say to Senator Aldridge? "Excuse me," Rachel said to Stephanie, who had been mid-sentence, before striding toward the kitchen. By the time she reached them, Grace was shaking Evelyn's hand with what looked like respect, or was it admiration? Evelyn's face was calm, as always, but there was a flicker of something Rachel hadn't seen before. Confidence. "Eh? What's going on here?" Rachel asked, her voice sharper than intended. Both women turned to her. Grace spoke first. "Mrs. Carter, you never mentioned you had such remarkable talent in your household." Rachel blinked. I'm sorry." "Dr. Evelyn Lewis," Grace said, emphasizing the title. "I knew I recognized her, but it took me a moment to place her. She was one of the youngest partners at Brewster and Klein, wasn't she? A trailblazer in corporate law." Rachel's mouth went dry. "What?" Evelyn, still composed, gave Rachel a small nod. "Yes, I was." "You were," Rachel repeated, her voice rising. The murmurs of nearby guests began to grow louder as they tuned into the unexpected exchange. "You're saying you used to be?" "A corporate lawyer?" "Yes," Evelyn interrupted gently. "I worked at Brewster and Klein for nearly a decade before stepping away." Grace smiled warmly. "A shame to lose someone of your caliber in the legal world, but I imagine you had your reasons." Evelyn nodded, her expression unreadable. "I did." Rachel's head swam. The conversations around her seemed to blur as a single question thundered in her mind: why didn't I know this? The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Rachel moved through her duties like a ghost, smiling and laughing at the appropriate moments, but her mind was elsewhere. Every time she looked at Evelyn, she saw a stranger, a woman with a life and career Rachel couldn't reconcile with the person who folded her son's laundry and packed his lunches. After the guests had left and the house was quiet, Rachel cornered Evelyn in the kitchen. "Why didn't you tell me?" Rachel demanded, her voice low but urgent. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Evelyn paused, wiping her hands on a dish towel before meeting Rachel's gaze. "You didn't ask." "That's not an answer," Rachel snapped. "I hired you to be my nanny, and now I find out you're some kind of high-powered lawyer. What are you even doing here?" Evelyn's composure remained unshaken. "With respect, Mrs. Carter, I don't believe my past affects my ability to do my job." Rachel stared at her, incredulous. "You can't expect me to believe that. People like you don't just walk away from careers like that to clean kitchens and look after other people's kids." Evelyn's eyes softened, and for the first time Rachel saw a flicker of vulnerability beneath her calm exterior. "Sometimes, Mrs. Carter, life takes us in directions we don't anticipate. I needed a change, and this job allowed me the space to rebuild." To rebuild what? Rachel pressed. Evelyn hesitated, then shook her head. "That's personal." "Personal." Rachel wanted to scream. "Nothing about this feels personal." Evelyn had been in her home, a part of her family's life, and yet she felt like a stranger. That night, as Rachel lay in bed, sleep evaded her. Her mind kept replaying the senator's words, Evelyn's calm revelations, and the strange weight in her voice when she said rebuild. Rachel prided herself on control, on understanding the world around her. But Evelyn had unraveled that. She wasn't just a nanny, she was a puzzle Rachel didn't know how to solve. And for the first time in years, Rachel felt something she wasn't accustomed to: doubt. Doubt about her assumptions, about the neat boxes she put people in. Who was Evelyn Lewis, really? And why did her story feel like a mirror Rachel wasn't ready to look into? The morning after the party, Rachel awoke with an uneasy weight in her chest. She moved through her usual routine, mechanically coffee, emails, coordinating Oliver's school drop-off, while her thoughts circled around Evelyn like a predator stalking prey. Every interaction with her nanny felt fraught now, as if Evelyn's every movement was laced with secrets Rachel couldn't begin to fathom. When Evelyn arrived that morning, punctual as always, Rachel watched her carefully. Evelyn greeted Oliver warmly, reminding him to grab his water bottle before heading out. She carried herself with the same quiet confidence Rachel had always admired but now found unsettling. How could someone so composed, so professional, have lived an entirely different life without Rachel ever suspecting it? Rachel didn't address it directly at first, but curiosity gnawed at her. Once Oliver was off to school, Rachel called Stephanie, her most trusted confidante. "You will not believe what I found out last night," Rachel began, pacing her immaculate kitchen. "Evelyn, my nanny Evelyn, was a corporate lawyer, a partner at some big firm." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Stephanie replied, "Wait, are you serious? You're Evelyn?" "Yes," Rachel said, her voice rising. Senator Aldridge recognized her. Apparently she was a big deal. "Well, that's odd," Stephanie said slowly. "Why would someone like that end up working for you?" "That's exactly what I want to know," Rachel said. "But she won't talk about it. She just said it was personal." Stephanie let out a low hum of disapproval. "You should be careful, Rach. People like that don't just step down for no reason. What if she's hiding something?" The thought sent a shiver through Rachel. She hung up soon after, determined to find answers. Rachel waited until Evelyn left for her lunch break before sitting down at her laptop. She started with a simple Google search, Evelyn Lewis Brewster Klein. What she found stopped her cold. Dozens of articles popped up, some from high-profile legal publications. Evelyn had been a star lauded for her work in corporate litigation, named one of the most promising young attorneys in the state. Her photo appeared in several of the articles, her sharp suits and confident smile a stark contrast to the understated appearance Rachel was familiar with. But then, the tone of the articles shifted. Scattered among the accolades were stories of a high-profile case gone wrong. Evelyn had represented a major corporation accused of systemic discrimination. The case had been a media firestorm, drawing national attention. Though Evelyn's firm ultimately settled, the fallout was immense. Protests outside her office, scathing op-eds, and a public image tainted by association with the case. Shortly afterward, Evelyn resigned from the firm. And then, nothing. It was as if she had vanished. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. Why hadn't Evelyn mentioned any of this? The image of Evelyn as the composed, capable nanny now felt like a mask concealing something far more complicated. That evening, Rachel waited until after dinner to confront Evelyn. She found her in the living room, tidying up after Oliver's homework session. "Evelyn," Rachel began, trying to keep her tone neutral. "Can we talk for a moment?" Evelyn straightened, smoothing her skirt. "Of course, Ma, I am." Rachel hesitated, unsure how to phrase her question. Finally, she said, "I looked you up today." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but Rachel noticed a flicker of something in her eyes, resignation, perhaps. "I see. You used to be a partner at Brewster and Klein," Rachel continued. "Why didn't you tell me?" Evelyn took a deep breath, setting down the book she had been holding. "Because it has no bearing on the work I do here." "No bearing," Rachel repeated, incredulous. "Evelyn, you were on the front page of major newspapers. You were part of a case that shook the entire legal world. And now you're—" She caught herself before finishing the sentence. "Just a nanny." "I don't deny my past," Evelyn said calmly. "But I chose to leave that life behind. It wasn't who I wanted to be anymore." Rachel frowned. "Why not? You were so successful. Why give that up?" Evelyn hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, she said, "Success comes with a cost, Mrs. Carter. That case you read about, it wasn't just a professional failure. It was a moral one. I represented a company that harmed people who looked like me. And I justified it to myself because I thought I could change the system from the inside. But I couldn't." Her voice faltered for the first time, a crack in her otherwise impenetrable calm. After the settlement, I realized I had become someone I didn't recognize, someone I didn't want to be. Rachel was stunned into silence. She had expected excuses or justifications, but Evelyn's candor left her unsettled. For the first time, she glimpsed the depth of the woman she had underestimated. "I'm sorry," Rachel said quietly. It was an unfamiliar feeling humility, but she meant it. Evelyn nodded, accepting the apology without comment. "If you have any concerns about my ability to do my job, I understand. But I can assure you my past has no bearing on my work with your family." Rachel shook her head. "No, it's not that. I didn't realize." "You didn't ask," Evelyn said, her tone gentle but firm. And with that, she excused herself, leaving Rachel alone with her thoughts. That night, Rachel lay awake, replaying Evelyn's words in her mind. She thought about the burden Evelyn must carry, the courage it must have taken to walk away from everything. And she thought about her own assumptions, the neat boxes she had placed Evelyn in, boxes that no longer seemed to fit. For the first time in a long time, Rachel wondered if she had something to learn from someone she had once dismissed. Rachel found herself seated at the kitchen table the next morning, stirring her coffee absently. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the room, but her mind was already spinning. Evelyn had been quiet since their conversation the night before, completing her tasks with her usual efficiency, but Rachel felt the tension in the air. The more she thought about Evelyn's revelations, the more questions surfaced, questions she could no longer ignore. "Evelyn," Rachel called softly as the nanny entered the kitchen, carrying a neatly folded pile of laundry. Evelyn paused, glancing at her employer with a measured expression. "Yes, ma, I am." "Could you sit for a moment?" Rachel gestured to the chair across from her. Evelyn hesitated but placed the laundry on the counter and complied, sitting with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her composed demeanor was unshaken, but Rachel thought she saw a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. Rachel leaned forward, her coffee forgotten. "I need to understand. Why did you choose this life? Not just leaving law, but becoming a nanny of all things. Someone with your background could have done anything." Evelyn exhaled softly, her gaze dropping for a moment before meeting Rachel's eyes. "When I left my career, I didn't just leave a job. I left behind an entire identity, one that was wrapped up in ambition, power, and choices I wasn't proud of. I needed something different, something grounded. Being a nanny allowed me to focus on what matters most: nurturing, teaching, and finding peace in small, meaningful moments." Rachel listened, trying to reconcile the woman in front of her with the powerful lawyer described in those articles. But why not teach, or work in a less demanding role within law? It's so far removed from what you used to do. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "I wanted simplicity, Mrs. Carter. I wanted to strip away the noise and find joy in the fundamental things like helping a child learn or bringing calm to a busy household. It may seem like a step down to you, but for me, it's been a step toward clarity." Rachel felt a pang of guilt at the assumption embedded in her words. She had spent so much time viewing Evelyn through the lens of class and occupation, never considering the possibility that this life might have been a deliberate choice, not a fallback. "But it must be difficult," Rachel pressed. "Being here, knowing what you left behind." Evelyn's gaze softened. "It was at first. I won't pretend it's been easy. There are moments when I question myself, when I wonder if I should have fought harder to stay in that world and change it from within. But then I see children like Oliver, and I remember why I made this choice." Rachel was quiet for a moment, her thoughts swirling. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I think I've misunderstood you from the beginning. I judged you without really knowing who you were." Evelyn smiled faintly, her composure intact. "We all make assumptions, Mrs. Carter. What matters is what we do once we realize they're wrong." The conversation marked a shift between them. Though Evelyn resumed her duties as usual, Rachel couldn't stop thinking about her words. It wasn't just Evelyn's past that intrigued her, it was the quiet strength with which she had reshaped her life, choosing purpose over prestige. That afternoon, Rachel found herself at her laptop again, this time researching ways to support organizations fighting the same injustices Evelyn had once encountered in her career. For the first time in years, Rachel felt compelled to step outside her insular world and engage with something larger. Later that evening, As Evelyn read to Oliver, Rachel stood in the doorway watching them. Oliver leaned against Evelyn's shoulder, his eyes bright as she animated the characters in the story. Rachel couldn't deny the bond they shared, a bond rooted in trust, patience, and care. It was a side of Evelyn Rachel had always overlooked, too caught up in her own perceptions to appreciate the full scope of who she was. For the first time, Rachel realized she didn't need to solve Evelyn. She simply needed to understand her, to see her for who she truly was. And in doing so, Rachel felt the faint stirrings of change within herself, a glimmer of hope that perhaps she could become someone different too. The next few days passed quietly in the Carter household, but the silence between Rachel and Evelyn was no longer strained. It felt almost contemplative, as though both women were mulling over the unspoken shift in their dynamic. Rachel observed Evelyn more closely than ever, not with the judgment she once wielded, but with curiosity and a budding respect. One evening, as Rachel prepared dinner, a rare occurrence for her, she decided to act on the changes stirring within her. Oliver was at the dining table, engrossed in a math worksheet Evelyn had prepared, and the nanny herself was folding linens in the adjoining room. Evelyn Rachel called softly, her tone warmer than it had been in months. "Could you come here for a moment?" Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her expression polite but cautious. "Yes, ma, I am." Rachel hesitated, clutching the edge of the counter for support. Vulnerability was not a familiar state for her. "I wanted to thank you." Evelyn blinked, surprised. "For what?" "For everything," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "For the way you've cared for Oliver, for the way you've managed this household, and for your patience with me." Evelyn's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing, allowing Rachel to continue. "I've been unfair to you," Rachel admitted. "I made assumptions about you, and I let my own insecurities dictate how I treated you. But seeing you with Oliver, hearing your story, it's made me realize how narrow my perspective has been." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her composed exterior softening just a fraction. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Carter, but I didn't expect anything from you other than the opportunity to do my job." "I know," Rachel said quickly, "and that's exactly why I feel so ashamed. You've given so much to this family, and I've given so little in return." Evelyn's silence was not accusatory, but it hung in the air like a mirror reflecting Rachel's own words back at her. "I'd like to change that," Rachel said finally. "I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'd like to start by helping you in any way I can. If there's something you need personally, professionally, just tell me." Evelyn's eyes softened, a flicker of emotion breaking through her usual restraint. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. That means a great deal." Rachel nodded, feeling a weight lift from her chest. For the first time in years, she felt like she had taken a step toward becoming the person she wanted to be, not the person she thought she needed to be. The opportunity to act on her promise came sooner than Rachel expected. A week later, Oliver's school announced an upcoming fundraiser, with parents and community members invited to donate and participate. The event was focused on supporting underserved children in the district, a cause that struck a chord with Rachel after everything she had learned from Evelyn. Rachel approached Evelyn one evening with the flyer in hand. "Would you be willing to help me with this?" she asked. "I thought we could do something meaningful together." Evelyn studied the flyer for a moment before nodding. "I'd be happy to." The two women worked side by side in the days leading up to the event, brainstorming ideas and organizing contributions. Rachel watched in awe as Evelyn navigated the preparations with ease, her sharp intellect and natural leadership shining through. It was clear that the skills she had honed in her past life were still very much a part of her. When the day of the fundraiser arrived, Rachel and Evelyn stood together at their booth, which featured an interactive activity for children to learn about the value of community support. Rachel marveled at how easily Evelyn engaged with the children and parents, her warmth and authenticity drawing people in. Toward the end of the event, the principal approached them with a microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone who has gone above and beyond for our community." Rachel assumed the principal was referring to her. After all, she had been a major donor for years. But as the principal continued, her heart swelled with pride and humility. "Evelyn Lewis has been a quiet force for good in our school and beyond," the principal said, gesturing toward Evelyn. "Her dedication, kindness, and leadership have made a lasting impact on our students and families. Please join me in giving her a well-deserved round of applause." The crowd erupted into cheers and Rachel joined in, tears pricking her eyes as she watched Evelyn accept the recognition with grace. Later that evening, back at the Carter home, Rachel poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to Evelyn. They sat together on the patio, the cool night air carrying the faint scent of jasmine. "I've been thinking," Rachel began, swirling the wine in her glass, "about what you said about rebuilding your life." Evelyn took a sip of her wine, her expression contemplative. "And I don't think it's just your life you've rebuilt," Rachel said. "You've done that for my family too. For me." Evelyn glanced at her, something unspoken passing between them. "I think we've both done some rebuilding." Rachel smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "I'm glad you stayed." Evelyn nodded, her own smile faint but sincere. "So am I." The next morning, as Rachel walked Oliver to the bus stop, he turned to her with a question that stopped her in her tracks. "Mom," he said, looking up at her with wide eyes, "do you think Evelyn will always be with us?" Rachel crouched down to meet his gaze, her heart tightening. "I don't know, sweetheart. But I hope so." Oliver nodded, satisfied with her answer, and hugged her tightly before climbing onto the bus. As Rachel watched the bus pull away, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't known she needed. Evelyn had entered their lives as an enigma, someone Rachel had underestimated and misunderstood. But through Evelyn's quiet strength and unwavering integrity, Rachel had been forced to confront her own biases, her own shortcomings. And in doing so, she had found not just a nanny but a teacher, a partner, and a friend. For the first time in years, Rachel felt like she was looking at the world through a different lens, a lens sharpened by compassion, understanding, and the realization that true wealth wasn't found in the size of her home or the exclusivity of her social circle. It was found in the connections she built, the lessons she learned, and the changes she made for the better. Evelyn had shown her that. And Rachel was ready to embrace it.